First, do you oppose nuclear power? And if so, why? Have you gotten clear on why? Is it because of the risk of an accident? Is it the waste? Is it the fear of nuclear weapons? Is it that you don't think nuclear power is necessary? Now is your chance to put your anti-nuclear bona fides to the test. We are playing Ask the Nuclear Engineer. The outgoing safety boss of the new Lucas Heights nuclear reactor is a so-called superstar of STEM. She's the president of the Australian Nuclear Association, and she joins me in studio to take your calls about why nuclear power is or is not safe. Thank you so much for being here. I know this is a first radio appearance for you.
Not first radio appearance, but
first here
taking
in this,
questions.
First taking questions on
in
the
a radio format.
Okay, great. Dr. Jo Lackenby is with us, nuclear engineer. Joe, and I should emphasise for the listener, where we have no necessary pretense of an impartial debate here. We're not structuring this as being like, well, Joe says this because she thinks that nuclear is safe, and then we're also going to have someone who doesn't believe in that. This is a fact-finding mission for you, and we will follow it up with other voices that will round out the conversation. So, there's no point in sending a text message saying, but this person is a shill for the nuclear industry. She's not. She's a nuclear engineer and she knows what she's talking about. But yes, she does come from that side of things. What is the most common preconception, do you think, about nuclear power that the nuclear industry has to overcome?
I think there's quite a few, but I think there's a preconception that people have that nuclear energy is dangerous. I think some people also find it quite scary because they've basically, people like my age have had their nuclear education from The Simpsons. So there's a bit of a scary, side to it. But it might be scary, but it isn't dangerous.
I'm glad that you raised The Simpsons because I did have this to go.
Congratulations on your purchase of a Fissionator 1952 slow fission reactor. Don't get to the point, man! Woo, what's this? Don't! Who'd have thought a nuclear reactor would be so complicated?
When you say that it's not dangerous, of course, everybody who's listening is going to be thinking, how can you say that it's not dangerous if Chernobyl happened? How can you say it's not dangerous if 3 Mile Island happened? How can you say it's not dangerous if Fukushima happened? What's the response?
So all those things definitely happened. I'm obviously not going to deny that those things happened. I guess with any form of energy generation, there's benefits and there's risks. So there's a great website called Our World in Data, and I think everyone should have a look at this themselves. Just don't take my word on it, but it shows the death rates from different energy sources as a function of how much energy they've created over their lifetimes. And this website puts nuclear as safe and as clean as renewables.
Right. So that's sort of a comparative argument, which is the argument that says that nuclear accidents are a little bit like plane crashes in the sense that they all happen at once and they scare us, but actually air travel is safer than car travel. It's just that the car deaths are scattered throughout every day, so we don't notice it, and the deaths from carbon emissions happen all the time due to chronic diseases and pulmonary diseases and climate chaos and so on, and those don't get factored in. But what about the argument that nuclear accidents actually are less likely today? Because I hear the nuclear industry saying, we don't make reactors like the Chernobyl reactor anymore. We make these reactors that are foolproof. And something inside me goes, foolproof? Foolproof. Are you sure?
Well, it's funny that clip that you just played from The Simpsons, it mentioned the word 1952. And I think another thing that the nuclear industry overcomes is to communicate the fact that the technology is changing and evolving in time. Just like planes are getting better, reactors are getting better. Pretty much every technology is getting better. So the kind of reactors under construction today are a step up from those reactors designed and constructed in the 70s and 80s. And the things on offer, from the 2030s onwards will be different again. So with time comes technological advances, including increases in safety, keeping in mind that nuclear is as safe as other technologies today. It just has that reputation of being dangerous.
Can it melt down?
Can what specifically?
A reactor.
Yeah. Yes, it could. It could, but there's so much engineering and a big focus as well on safety culture and people to try to reduce the likelihood as much as possible.
Right. We're speaking with Dr. Jo Lackenby, who's a nuclear engineer, was responsible for the safety of the Lucas Heights reactor, and is the sort of a superstar of STEM and the president of the Australian Nuclear Association. Ask her your question about nuclear. If you think that nuclear power is toxic and bad and a terrible idea, then here is your opportunity to speak with the most senior person, essentially, who's in charge of safety at an Australian nuclear reactor on 1300 222 702 about how the ins and outs actually work. And Jo is very bashfully waving her arms around saying, "That's not true.
I need to clarify, sorry. I was not responsible for safety. I was responsible for overseeing licensing and regulation to make sure we're meeting our safety requirements. Just to clarify that. We have a reactor manager. Most nuclear reactors in the world have a reactor manager.
Right.
They're usually the
You're
responsible
responsible for safety compliance. You're not responsible for the day-to-day safety of the operation of the
That's
reactor.
Correct. So I give advice and it's taken.
You know a thing or two about nuclear engineering, though, don't you?
I do.
Jason in Avalon has given us a call. Hello, Jason.
Hi, Josh. How are you?
Terrific. What's your question for Jo?
My question is regarding micro-nuclear and the fact that doesn't seem to be much of the conversation out there at the moment, but from what I read, it's from a safety point of view, it's has huge benefits, and also being able to deploy those micro reactors a lot quicker than building a large plant, for instance, and what the actual facts are about that.
Thanks, Jason. What's a micro-nuclear reactor, Jo?
So the nuclear reactors typically come in 3 different sizes. Your standard big nuclear reactor, about 1 gigawatt or even bigger. You've got small modular reactors up to about 300 megawatts, so very similar to many of the coal plants in Australia. And then you have micro reactors, which are even smaller again, and some can fit inside a shipping container. So one of the benefits of a micro reactor would be that they would be, for example, great to use on a mine site, where you can literally plug them in to supply energy for a decade or more, and then switch them over when they need refueling with a brand new reactor. So microreactors are small and small modular reactors, so probably in the tens of megawatts range.
And why would a country like Australia need nuclear power? I mean, I hear opponents of nuclear power saying, like, even if we disagree about the risks, even if we disagree about the waste, we have so much sunlight and we have so much wind, why wouldn't we just make a fast transition to renewables? But then I hear nuclear experts saying we're not going to be able to get up to speed quickly enough, and just, nuclear power may not be the long-term solution for us, but for the next century, it'll be a great stopgap to keep things running while we perfect renewables. And I don't know who to believe.
It's a very, very good question. So my philosophy in this is that we should be building as many renewables as we can in the 2020s, because we can do it right now, and be starting to incorporate nuclear in the 2030s. The reason being is that there was a great study out of MIT that showed if your aim is deep decarbonisation, like an electricity system basically making no emissions, to keep the prices down, you need to add nuclear in. And the reason why you need nuclear in the mix is because if you don't have that nuclear component, you need to completely overbuild your solar wind batteries to provide reliability. And when you're building more and more renewables to maintain reliability, it's obviously going to start costing a lot more. So having a nuclear component in there to balance that out should provide the cheapest prices.
But don't proponents of renewables say, well, battery technology is moving so fast that very soon we'll be able to use batteries to retain the energy that renewables provide, and we'll be able to use things like hydro batteries, which are basically just pumping the water back uphill and putting it in a big lake and then having it flow downhill and stuff, and that it's a fool's errand to invest in something dirty like nuclear?
Nuclear being the cleanest technology with the lowest carbon emissions in the world.
I'm speaking in the minds of the renewable advocate.
No problems. So the biggest battery in Australia right now, I believe, is Hornsdale. And if you wanted to run New South Wales' biggest aluminium smelter from that battery would last shorter than 10 minutes. So my understanding is, and I'm not a battery expert, but my understanding is that grid-scale storage with batteries doesn't exist. The batteries today are there to stabilise the grid and control the frequency and other system parameters.
Right. So basically, when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, you're always going to need something, and you're saying that something might as well be nuclear.
That's correct, yeah. That combination together will give us the lowest carbon emissions and the lowest prices for energy in the long term.
We're speaking with Dr. Jo Lackenby, who's a nuclear engineer who was not in charge of safety at the Lucas Heights nuclear reactor, but was in charge of safety compliance at the Lucas Heights nuclear reactor. She is also the president of the Australian Nuclear Association. She's answering your questions about nuclear. This is not an impartial conversation. You don't need to get angry at us for not presenting the other side. We will do other segments where we present the other side, and I hardly think that that we don't give enough airtime to the other side, the anti-nuclear side as well. This is purely about a fact check of what is true and what is untrue from the point of view of somebody who knows their nuclear stuff, and Jo knows her nuclear stuff better than anyone. Shane in Glenmore Park, what did you want to ask Jo?
Oh, hello. Look, I know that coal-fired power stations produce power around, I don't know, $30, $35 a megawatt. So comparing that to a nuclear power station, it'd be a lot cheaper for a nuclear power station to produce power. Would that be correct?
Than what? Cheaper for a nuclear
coal-fired power station.
Oh, right, I see. So
solar panels and wind generation costs a lot of money. In fact, it's up around $200 a megawatt to produce that power. But I've been sort of informed that nuclear power stations make it 4 cents per megawatt.
Thank you, Shane. And Jo, I'll actually spin off Shane's question by asking a version of another question that we got on the text line from Dave in Curl, which says, are the new nuclear power plants cheaper overall than wind farms and other renewable sources of energy, including building and infrastructure and the initial carbon footprint?
Well, these are very, very big questions. I love them so much. Okay, if you were to build, say, 500 megawatts of nuclear and 500 megawatts of wind, they're not apples and apples. They're apples and oranges, because I'll take some numbers out of the US, because that's the country that probably publishes their numbers the best. So in the US, they'll run their nuclear plants at about 92 to 93% capacity, meaning they'll get 92 to 93% of the maximum energy out of their system of nuclear power plants. Their wind farms are running at about 35% capacity. So a nuclear plant will operate more consistently for longer periods of time than a wind plant will, just because wind is variable. So even though a nuclear plant will cost more to build than that 500 megawatts of wind, the nuclear plant's operating more and when you need it, whereas a wind farm may or may not produce energy when you need it. Hence, that's why you need storage. So in some countries, like the US, nuclear is cheaper, or is the cheapest way to produce energy, or very cheap, or very close to it, because they've got the plants, they're operating well, they know how to operate them, maintain them. So once you've got a well-established nuclear industry, you can maximise your operation, and that really brings the cost down.
And how long does a plant live? How long does a plant last?
Okay, most of the plants operating today had an operating lifetime of 40 years when they were designed originally, but now some in the US have been given licenses up to 80 years.
Right.
A modern plant today, 60 years plus.
Got it. And so when you factor in the cost of building the plant initially and you amortise that cost across the life of the plant, is it still cheaper? Or is it only cheaper once you forget about all the money you spent building the nuclear reactor?
Well, there's other things with wind and solar, and I just don't want to be too negative against wind and solar, but these things tend to get built away from where the energy is needed. So something else you need in that system is transmission lines and other ways to strengthen the grid. Those costs also need to be added to the cost of renewables. But for nuclear, like is what's happening in the US, you can directly replace a coal-fired plant with a nuclear plant. You've got your infrastructure there for cooling, you've got your power lines, you've got most of your workforce too. I think what Australia probably needs to do is take a more of a long-term vision of energy. Let's look to 2050, 2060. Where are people going to be living? What are their jobs going to be? How much energy do they need? And then design the best, cheapest, lowest carbon system we can, and then work backwards.
Right, I see.
Because I think if nuclear costs more to build on a megawatt basis, that's fine. But if a nuclear plant lasts 100 years and a wind plant lasts 25 years, you're basically replacing parts of a wind farm every 25 years, and the nuclear plant's kind of just keeps going.
Got it. Dr. Jo Lackenby, one of Australia's foremost nuclear experts and nuclear engineer, is with us to answer your questions, because a lot of us have sort of latent presumptions against nuclear power, and this is not meant to be a rah pro-nuclear segment. We'll do other segments in which people who are more sceptical of nuclear power also join us and take your questions. But just in order to dispel any myths and try to tease out why we are opposed to nuclear power, if we are opposed to nuclear power, it's useful to actually understand what we're talking about, and Jo is here to help us do that. Brett has given us a call. Hello, Brett.
Oh, g'day. Yeah.
G'day.
I just had a question about if you were to replace coal-fired stations like you're talking about with a reactor, well, how much toxic waste are we talking about? Is it train loads? Is it truckloads?
Sorry, Brett. I just dropped you for 1 second, but carry on there. It's a great question, Brett. Yeah. So basically, when we're talking about this nuclear waste that everyone's terrified of lasting for hundreds of generations, you're asking how much are we actually talking about? I can't hear you again, Brett. Sorry about that. My mistake. Jo, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go back to the US again, because like I said, they're very good at publishing their data. So over 60 years of nuclear energy generation in the US, where they're currently getting 20% of their energy or electricity from nuclear and about 50% of their clean energy. So 60 years of civilian nuclear energy power station operation, you can fit all of their high-level nuclear waste on a football field to the height of 10 feet. So if you translate that into Australian speak, it's probably a rugby league field to the height of about 3 metres, give or take.
And that's produced by how many?
There's had over 100 civilian nuclear reactors over the last 60 years. So we're talking about not much waste. It's the most energy-dense form of energy available to us, nuclear fission.
Okay. Does that make sense, Brett? We're not talking about train loads and train loads of the stuff.
That's interesting, yeah, because I've had discussions with these people over time, and that was when I actually went looking for an answer to that, and couldn't find it. But that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it is counterintuitive, isn't it, Brett? Because I think a lot of us think, there are going to be mountains of the stuff. You're going to have to bury whole mountains of nuclear waste or something. Right, yeah, not just a few barrels.
There's not much of it,
Brett.
and it's a solid material too, which makes its handling much easier than like a liquid or a gas.
Right.
Just to put it into people's minds, a uranium pellet, about the size of a gummy bear, if you can imagine that in your head, that produces as much energy as 800 to 900 kilograms of coal.
Right, almost a ton of coal. In a gummy bear.
Of uranium, yes.
And how much waste is that going to produce? Is there any way of articulating that? Does that end up being a gummy bear at the end of the process?
Pretty much, yep. Gummy bear goes in, gummy bear comes out. But as I just talked about last week at a TEDx Sydney event, probably 95% of that gummy bear is recyclable.
Yes, this is another question that's come in on the text line from a listener named Adrian, who says, in the Bill Gates documentary a few years ago, he talked about slow-wave reactors that use the waste from old-style reactors and were generally more efficient and environmentally friendly. Are they an option?
I don't know about the travelling wave reactor specifically, but there's a thing called a fast reactor. And that's actually Bill Gates' design. He's the one who's replacing a coal plant with a nuclear plant in Wyoming in the US. So I'm a big fan of these fast reactors because one of their capabilities is using nuclear waste from existing nuclear power plants as their source of fuel.
Right. And they take in how much of that waste and use it and then emit how much more. If I have my gummy bear of waste that's come out of an old nuclear reactor, then how much of that do I get to use?
I guess in the ideal world where the scientists and engineers have nailed this, because it's still being, undergoing research and development at the moment, but in the world where fast reactors are common, you can get 60 times more energy from the same amount of uranium compared to today's nuclear reactors.
Wow, really?
Yes, that's correct, 60 times.
Wow, okay, right. So you're talking about 1/60th of a gummy bear for the same amount of energy.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Peter on the Central Coast, what did you want to ask Jo?
Joe, from my understanding, nuclear power generation, it's very thirsty. It requires water, a lot of water, and that's why they're built near large river systems or the ocean. And in Australia, our population centres around, it's coastal. And the word event, I'm talking about, okay, it might be very rare, but if an event occurs, you never associate that word event with solar power or wind farms. Now, they can be placed anywhere. away from populations. So I'm just saying the practicalities of establishing a nuclear power plant, it would be near large-ish populations compared to other forms of power generation.
Right, and I think I have a similar question. But Peter, when you say that you never hear about an event, I mean, you understand how the news media works, right? I mean, I work in this industry, and you never hear about you very rarely hear about a car crash event, but that doesn't mean that driving is safer than flying. You hear about air events, and you don't hear about the lives that are lost from people who are building wind farms and the construction worker falls off because there's only one of them, but that might happen 500 times over the course of 50 years, and there might be one
Josh, the
nuclear
word
event.
event normally applies to the loss of life, which is major. That's what I'm trying to stress. I mean,
But what I'm saying is if you divide that major loss of life up into individual incidents that happen every single day over the course of 100 years because of coal-fired power plants, then they're just not a single event, you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, Josh, if I could build you the best mansion, the most beautiful house you'd ever want to live in, and it was 3 kilometres away from a nuclear power plant, would you take it for free?
Well, I mean, it's not really about me. I personally would, because I would just follow the science. But I mean, it would depend on what the scientists told me. Yeah, I mean, but it's not about me.
Right,
but thank you, Peter. Penny and Menai, did you have a similar question about the location of nuclear reactors?
Yes, exactly. I just wondered where they were planned. If they were going to put them in New South Wales, where would they site them?
Thank you, Penny. Joe?
I think with any big infrastructure program, you need the support of the local community. Right. Can't talk, sorry. It will be the same with nuclear as well. So there's many different options. And to go back to the last caller, some nuclear reactors are actually air-cooled. They don't need big, what do you call it?
Like water, huge tanks.
Big
of,
rivers or
right.
ocean or something. You can air-cool them too.
Yeah.
So they could go in many different places, especially the new reactors that are coming in the next 10 years, being the small modular reactors. They have a lot more potential to be sited in a whole lot of different places because of their lower need for water.
Thank you, Penny. Dr. Jo Lackenby, the nuclear engineer, is with us answering all of your questions about nuclear power in the Ask the Nuclear Engineer segment of the show. On the text line, let's burn through a few of these because we only have a few minutes left, Joe. One person says, more context on the gummy bear's worth of uranium versus a ton of coal. Does that provide enough electricity to power Sydney for an hour, a day, a month?
That is a fantastic question. I cannot answer that off the top of my head.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, but I mean, if the
find that out, though.
Well, if the total amount that all of America's nuclear reactors have produced in 60 years it only fills a football oval 3 metres deep, then it's probably got to power Sydney for more than an hour, and probably more than I don't know. It's hard to know, isn't it? But
I'm trying to think of some numbers off the top of my head. I just don't want to get it wrong.
We will find out.
It's not much. It's a tiny, tiny amount of uranium per household per year.
Yeah, we will find out. Also on the text line, a bunch of people are saying, look, it doesn't matter if it's the size of a gummy bear. If it's incredibly dangerous, then the waste still matters. What do we do with the waste?
Very good question, actually. And I would argue it's not dangerous and that civilian use fuel has never hurt anybody. If you look on the
it's dangerous if I just take the piece of uranium and I touch it, right?
The uranium itself, not so much.
If I picked up the nuclear waste,
sorry,
after it comes out of a nuclear reactor, if I pick up a piece of nuclear waste, I'm not going to be well.
It's not as though you can just go and do that, though. It is stored in secure locations around the world. But yeah, you wouldn't want to go anywhere near it. But it is stored in these massive casks. You can walk around these casks. There's pictures of people doing it on the internet. The only PPE they tend to have is hard hats. Hard hats, no radiation protection PPE because the casks do such a good job, including surviving massive accidents like trains running into them. All this stuff has been tested. There's 2 things you can do with nuclear waste. 3, really. You can store it, like many countries are doing right now. You can recycle it and reuse it. That's actually what happens to Australia's used nuclear fuel. It goes over to France, where they remove most of the ingredients and then reuse some of it in their nuclear power plants. In the future, though, we can do recycling better, and there's a lot of R&D about how we can reuse pretty much 96% of nuclear waste in reactors again. And the other thing we can do with nuclear waste is we can dispose of it underground, which is what already happens for a lot of other toxic and hazardous chemicals. So in Finland, they've actually built the world's first underground geological nuclear waste disposal facility. The Finns have put their application to operate this into their nuclear regulator in Finland. So by about mid-decade, they're expecting to be able to start loading used nuclear fuel underground for long-term disposal.
Scott asks on the text line, "Hi Josh, ask the nuclear expert, what date would I be able to build my new house on the exact location of the Lucas Heights reactor when it's decommissioned? I'd be interested to know if it's several thousand years in the future."
Pretty much as soon as it's been released for public use again. So there's nuclear power plants around the world that have been decommissioned. They're called greenfield sites now. They've gone back to green fields. So they've taken away anything that is radioactive, and all that's left is dirt.
Right. Yeah. So it's not leach. I mean, it's probably commonsensical that it's not actually leaching radiation into the surrounding area.
Absolutely not. No.
Obviously, we would not be happy driving past that place or living around that place currently as well. Last question to Tian in Bathurst. G'day, Tian.
Hey there. I wanted to. I think what's been great is we've been putting things in perspective, and I wanted to invite you to put the risk of the human factor in perspective. So my concern with nuclear power is that a nuclear reactor can't be run by one person that we can make sure is, has got the best heart in the world and is not mistake prone. But the problem is a group of people that need to run it. And as soon as you have a group, you have diversity. You have some people that are prone to evil, some people that are prone to mistakes. So is it true to think that the risk of having people make mistakes or do evil things in a nuclear power plant is, the consequences of which are more serious than other sources of power?
Thank you, Tian. Joe, does nuclear power make nuclear terrorism or, rogue nations getting nuclear weapons more likely?
I'm not sure if that was quite the question that was asked, but I
Wasn't
guess...
Is that sort of it, Tian? That like...
No, not just evil, also just mistakes. Like mistakes that lead to a disaster.
Oh, I thought you said people with bad intentions.
That too, but I just think, when I talk to my friends, our concern is that if someone's working at a nuclear power plant that makes a mistake, I feel like the consequences of that are more serious than someone making a mistake in a coal power plant.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, take that whichever way you will, Joe.
I guess one of the fundamental design principles of a nuclear power plant is core defence in depth. So putting in place different barriers to prevent accidents from happening. Part of that is engineering, so putting in place good engineering systems, but part of that is also procedures and training and security and other things like that as well. So I think it would be difficult for an insider with bad intentions to cause a serious problem in a nuclear power plant, because often you can only go certain places if you've got somebody else with you, for example, and that kind of thing. I mean, you can't completely eliminate people making mistakes or doing the wrong thing, but you can definitely build in other barriers. So if they are able to do something that they're not supposed to be doing, then other things will stop it.
Joe, we could go for 14 hours here. We could get all of our gummy bears full of uranium stocked up. We still have a full board of calls, but I will love you and leave you. Thank you so much for fact-checking those things and for explaining that to us. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
That's Dr. Jo Lackenby, who's a nuclear engineer. She's the outgoing safety compliance boss of the Lucas Heights nuclear reactor, a so-called superstar of STEM, and she is also the president of the Australian Nuclear Association. We'll continue this conversation with a variety of voices over coming weeks and take your calls to round out our understanding of why Australians seemingly are more opposed to nuclear power than other countries. Is that still true? And does nuclear power play any kind of a role in Australia's energy mix in the future? It's 26 minutes